Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. As always, I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. And today we are continuing our mini series of podcast episodes on the federal election, Election 44, which comes to an end in about a week's time. We're recording this on Monday, September the 13th, and I'm joined by John Perenack, who is a principal at StrategyCorp, so technically another one of my bosses. He is a public affairs and communications expert. He runs our communications practice in the firm and has been an expert in this field for over 25 years. He specializes in crisis communications and reputation management. He's a media trainer and coach who helps spokespeople interact with the media and get their messages across clearly. And he also co-hosts his own podcast, the Reputation Town podcast, which discusses media relations, issues management, and corporate reputation of current events. He also does something very interesting, which we might talk about today a little bit, which is an apology tracker and rater, where he takes media personalities and celebrities and sees whether or not their apologies when they're trying to backtrack from things are effective. We might talk about that in the context of communications on this election campaign. So John, thanks for joining us today. Great to be here, Mitch. How are you doing today? Great. Yeah. So it's Monday morning, but no better way to start off the week than talking a little federal politics. So we should start things off with probably the most generic question, but the most obvious one in terms of the timeline again. So it being Monday the 13th, the English debates were last Thursday night. So just 3 or 4 nights ago, the French debates a few days before that. Curious about your view on that debate. Did any of the leaders come across clearly? Was there anything in that debate that stood out to you as a memorable moment, or was it all just kind of a wash?
So, well, the first and I think most important question is, did anyone ever actually watch that thing? Like somebody pointed out to me that there was I think the U.S. Open was on. There was a bunch of other sporting stuff happening that night, and it was easy to forget that thing was actually happening. I'll be honest, I only watched it after the fact because I was doing other stuff and completely forgot it was on. But at any rate, when you look at how people did in that, I think there was a general consensus that there really was no moment in that debate or no winner event that came out of that debate that materially is going to impact this campaign. Some people were attributing it to the fact that the format was one that didn't lend itself to that. But having said that, I can't remember an election debate in recent years where someone didn't complain about the format. It seems like to be the perilous sport that goes on with evaluating how people did. But just I like to look at these things from an aspect of what do voters actually see, because I'm not gonna pretend that I'm the most experienced election expert there is. There's a lot more people who are more expert than me, but having done communications for 25 years, I have a sense of how people internalize messages and how you can connect with people. And generally speaking, if there was anything that comes out of that, it's this idea that the prime minister was on the defensive, and really it was the other parties reinforcing this narrative that this election is about what you think of Justin Trudeau. And it's interesting because I don't really think that's what the Liberals wanted going into this. Some people say there's 2 types of elections. There's the referendum election and there's the choice election. And if you're running against a person who you think is, kind of unsavory, you want it to be a referendum, right? You want it to be, do you want that guy or that person or not? And that's not what I think Liberals wanted that maybe to be about O'Toole, but really in effect, it's actually a referendum on themselves. So what came out of that debate? Not a heck of a lot, other than to say that I think it kind of reinforced a little bit of the narrative that the Liberals are sort of on their back foot, as have been quite a bit in this campaign.
Yes, so you said something there that I really want to pick up on, I find is interesting, because anecdotally, a few friends who don't consider themselves very political tuned into the debate to try to get a sense of where parties were at. And their number one feedback to me was, what the hell was that? Right? Like everybody was at everybody. They just wanted to know what the party stood for. Like they couldn't get a word in. Agree with you some points about the moderators being too aggressive or what have you. One person even pointed out, which I thought was a good point, there wasn't really opening or closing statements, so they didn't even get to just make their pitch. But anecdotally speaking, the other thing that's come out constantly from people that I talk to, politicos and non-politicos, is this why are we having an election in the first place? And you mentioned this idea of a referendum or a choice election. When it comes to the communications around the need for election 44, did the Liberals get it wrong?
I think this is the fundamental question from a communications perspective. Like, that was a question I'm sure was on their, the Q&A they prepared for themselves and for candidates, why are we having this election? But really, like, it's the core of the whole thing. And I'm not sure they really had a good answer or still have a good answer for that. I boil it down again to what does a voter think? What does my mom think, right? Why are we having this? And if you can't have an answer that resonates in a simple way, so that it gets through the media and gets to people, whether they be, office workers or retirees or whomever, you got a real problem, because you're basically having an election that it doesn't need to happen now. It's happening probably in the worst circumstances imaginable. And people have a lot more important things on their mind, and you're kind of subjecting them to this campaign. So you really have to have a strong answer, and that isn't about just having words, right? Like, we talk about crisis communications a lot, both in our work at StrategyCorp and when we do speaking opportunities and on my podcast with Warner Weeks. The crisis communications only works well when you have some real substance behind what you're saying. And it isn't just about making up a bunch of words, because when you make up a bunch of words without substance, people see through it. And in this case, the answer that the government has, why they needed this election right now, which was, I think, in effect, they say, because we have to, get voters to give us or to decide on how we move forward out of the pandemic. That isn't a question I think people will see a lot of variation on between the parties, right? It's we can only go up from here, so I'm not sure what the big choices are, and because of that, because there isn't real substance behind that answer, they're having real problems with it. And I think that is ultimately what this whole thing will turn on, is the communications problem that exists at the core of the election call, and that's going to persist, because I don't see how they can turn that around in a real meaningful way in the time that's left.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting point there about the variation between the parties. So not only do we have this questionable call of an election campaign, or at least questionable in people's minds as to whether or not we should be in it from a political standpoint, that's a completely different conversation. But then even in the debate, you notice, the 5 major topics that were put on the table. Everybody's saying we need more government support for childcare. Everybody's saying we need to do more to get refugees out of Afghanistan. Everybody's saying we need to fight climate change. Everybody's saying we need to do more on Indigenous reconciliation. Go through the topics. All the parties were pretty unanimous in their opinions. They differed slightly on how they were going to do it. Mm-hmm. Is that a deliberate communication strategy to kind of fight those issues to a draw, and then make the election about leaders or about those small differences? Because I'm curious how you think the other parties, not so much the Liberal government that called this election, but how the other parties have either taken advantage of or failed to take advantage of this election opportunity to this point in the campaign so far.
So, good question. When you look at the Conservatives and their platform and the things they're talking about, they do elevate to a nice communications concept, this idea of security, stability, which by all accounts, I'm sure people will be really hungry for, because as you come out of this last 18 months of pandemic, what do you want, right? You want some return to normalcy, you want security, stability. So I can completely see why they built their platform and their communication structure the way they have. It makes a lot of sense. By the same token, if you look at the NDP, they've similarly done something to that effect, where it's we can do more for you, right? Which is going to appeal to their core constituency. And I think in their case, they really want to make sure they solidify their base and try and appeal to voters who maybe have been the beneficiaries of the additional things government's done for the past 18 months to help people. And so that all kind of ties up to a nice, simple concept, and those simple concepts are so key, because when a concept is simple, it gets through to people, right? It gets through the media filter. It gets through to those audiences who maybe aren't listening very, very closely, which is a lot of voters, right? Not everyone follows this thing, day to day. They just have a sort of a gut feel, a basic sense of the things they hear generally, in the news now and then, and they build their opinions and perceptions from that. So the more simple a message you have, the greater chance you're going to be able to get to those people. So I think in that case, that's been the strategy both those parties have undertaken. The Liberals have really changed their strategy, right? That when they started the campaign, when you look at some of the ads they did, it was kind of an inclusive, call to Canada to move forward together, and these kind of motherhood kind of statements that would work in any context. But then they pivoted very quickly to really identify controversial issues that really hadn't been in the consciousness of people, I don't think, or in the election campaign prior to that. And I think that's symptomatic of how they felt like they were losing some ground, and so they needed to change the ground the debate was happening on, from those general issues to more specific ones where they feel they have a greater advantage.
Yeah, that's a very fair observation. I mean, I think you kind of reminded me of, I think it was Dalton McGuinty. I want to say it was a former premier. I'm not positive, but he used to say the line something along the lines of, "When I get sick and tired of saying it, it's the first time that someone else has heard it," right? And you get that no more true than in political slogans in an election campaign. Every video that Aaron O'Toole does ends with "Secure the Future" or "Secure Canada" or whatever it might be, and same with the other parties. So a slogan is really this sort of boiled down version of what you're trying to sell to people in as little words as possible. But they can also be much more than that. So I remember on the 2018 provincial campaign that, of course, I was involved in, for Premier Ford. Now the slogan was "For the People." It's pretty well known about this slogan. But the more I thought about it, at first it was like, okay, for the people, populism, reaching out to the average Joe, sounds great. But then you kind of realize, like, in order to be for the people, you're implying that someone else is against the people, and you're creating a contrast in that, and you could kind of see that in Trudeau's "Forward for Everyone," implying that someone is either trying to take Canada backwards or is only trying to take the select few forwards. So we've got the three slogans out there: "Forward for Everyone" among the Liberals, "Secure the Future" for Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives, and Jagmeet Singh's "Ready for Better." Is one of these more effective than the other? Are these examples of good slogans? Is there any insight as a comms person that you could say as to what's going on with these, or are we really just reading way too far into three little words?
So it's a good question. I think some slogans do matter. I think certainly there can be some that are, I think sometimes they're created by the committee, and as a result, they don't mean a heck of a lot. But it really comes down to, what's behind it. I have this technique that we teach people when we do media training. So if you're a spokesperson and you're trying to remember all your key messages going into a media interview, one of the things we try and teach people is to write the headline in your mind of what you want to see above that story the next day. And what that inevitably does is it focuses your thoughts and simplifies it to just a few words, right? When you look at any newspaper, if you do look at a newspaper, maybe online, if you look at any story online, you can usually note that the headline is 7 words or fewer. And we teach people to do the same exercise. Think of that headline in your mind. It's fewer than 7 words, really concise. Keep that in your mind. And what that does is it inevitably, as you do the interview, kind of focuses your thoughts towards that simple concept that you want the headline to be. Not unlike, the kind of thing we were just talking about. From a slogan standpoint, that's what this is, right? It's kind of rolls up all the ethos and rolls up all the things you're trying to convey in your campaign into this really tight headline, so that people get a sense of, what you're all about. And, if on their own, I don't think they do a heck of a lot. Like one is maybe just as good as the other, but it's really what is the package that goes along with them. And in this case, I think I have to say that, the Conservatives have been sticking with theirs. Like you haven't seen them really vary from this, right? They've been very disciplined with their message. The NDP have been similarly very disciplined with their message when you look at the things. And interestingly, I like the fact that they were using a lot of compare and contrast in their in their ads to go along with this slogan, where they were trying to contrast Jagmeet Singh with Justin Trudeau, as the choices. And I think that's been effective for them. They certainly have been very stable in the polls, and I think they're probably going to do better than what the polls have been showing. That's totally anecdotally, and I'm famously wrong about most things, but I'm gonna put that out there just along with my my bad hockey picks from last year.
Yeah,
but from the slogan standpoint, I think it can matter, but at the end of the day, does it deliver anything on its own? Probably not.
So let's talk about that larger package then, because if that's what really matters, the advertisements, the commercials, those sorts of things. Let's talk about that, because I think before sort of asking you your opinion on some of the ads, it's worth stating that the average person, especially in the summer, like you mentioned, they're watching the Jays make a playoff run, or they're watching this U.S. Open tennis or whatever it might be. Maybe they're just sitting outside. They're not necessarily sitting in front of the television, right? So maybe they're getting their news on Twitter. Maybe they're hearing a radio or a TV ad. Maybe they're scrolling through Facebook and they see it. They're going to get targeted in some way, but it's not necessarily like they're not politicos. They're not necessarily you and I. They're not tuning into Justin Trudeau's platform launch. They're just not doing that, right? Yeah. They are interacting with the parties in small snippets, and normally those are in the form of advertisements. So we saw in the month of August about $2.5 million spend across Facebook, Instagram, and Messenger. Liberals leading that spending. Nowadays, so I'm curious about your thoughts on the election ads more generally. I think you touched on that a bit, but nowadays you can target so specifically with digital campaigning. You can get to people based on age, gender, location, that kind of specialty you just can't find in other mediums. So I'm curious, in addition to just how the advertising race has been going, is there still really a role for traditional radio and TV ads, or are they diminishing in their importance as these elections continue into the future?
I think there'll always be a role for that kind of broad-based awareness ad, which is kind of what general radio and broadcast does for campaigns. But to your point, what's most important, and has been for if really for the last 15 years, is the targeted digital ads, and they've only increased in importance over the years. Now, after the 2016 U.S. presidential election, there was a lot of introspection about how digital ads were used in that context, and so some of the platforms have changed the way they changed what you can do specifically in terms of targeting. But at the end of the day, when you look at platforms like Facebook and Instagram, which it owns, they make the revenue from advertising. And so being able to target specific groups is core to their business model. So you're never going to lose that entirely unless they decide to change their business model. So to your point about targeting, yeah, and we do this at StrategyCorp too for clients, where you need to reach certain stakeholder groups. And we can buy targeted ads to reach those groups very specifically with a specific message that that they're more likely going to react to in a positive way. And so what you have is a sort of a fragmentation of the campaigns, and you get, rather than a 30-second ad that runs on, in the newspaper or on broadcast TV, you get a fragmentation of, shorter digital ads. Could be just, still ads or video, but they're really tight. They're just a few seconds, and they're focused on that one little issue that you think that group's going to react to very specifically. And then you want to get that group to take an action. And typically online, that action is to interact with the campaign in some fashion. And that's the way you build your voter lists, and do your fundraising and all those sorts of things. So that is only going to increase, especially as more and more new platforms become available. As when you think about it now, the reason why Facebook has been so popular and so important with reaching voters is because it's one of the only social platforms where people who are 30 to 65 interact with. That's one of the myths, is that older Canadians don't interact on Facebook and those sorts of things. You can reach a heck of a lot of them on those platforms. But what's going to be more important is how do campaigns look at some of the newer platforms that are becoming so popular with younger Canadians, and Jagmeet Singh has done that with TikTok. How do you use those platforms in a campaign context and get the same sort of interaction or same sort of activation that you get with currently with Instagram and Facebook? So that's only going to increase. I think it also depends on who you see your voter base as, right? Like, I don't see the O'Toole campaign as active in some of those newer platforms because they don't really see that as their key constituency right now.
Yeah, and I mean, you've even got it to the point where political parties are handing out, cell phone numbers, and obviously, I don't think they're going to the phone that's in the pocket of the leader per se, but they're handing out cell phone numbers as different ways to get engagement, and they're doing all sorts of different things. I mean, gone are the days of putting a billboard up in front of your political opponent's campaign office so they think you're doing well, and now it's all about directly contacting the voters through multiple different mediums. And I really think the point about Facebook is an important one. Back in my political days, we used to say the same thing. Twitter was a waste of time. Advertising on Twitter was pointless. You're just reaching the same 1,500, 2,000 people who are actively engaged. Facebook is where real people are. I'm sure that's changed even in the 3 or 4 years since I was really dealing with it, but it's a fair point. One of the other things anecdotally I hear about ads all the time, which I think is really worth asking you, is this idea of sort of like cherry picking facts. I don't want to say it, I don't want to call it lying or misrepresenting, but being very selective in what you use. The common ad that I'll reference is, you kind of see all parties do it. You see this ad of newspaper headlines being splashed across the screen saying so-and-so doesn't support vaccines, or so-and-so wants to get rid of, this controversial thing. Is this, all is fair in love and war, and politics is pretty close to war? Is this fair game? Is there a benefit to political parties when they do this sort of manipulation, or is this just sort of par for the course? Like, I'm curious your thoughts about the transparency and the honesty in political advertising, particularly in this election campaign.
So you're right. I don't think it's new. I think this has been going on for a long time. I think even before, social media was a thing, this is something that campaigns did, right? You find the thing on your opponent that isn't very appealing, and you put it in even more unappealing light, and you use that as a point of differentiation between you and your opponent. It's just a lot easier to do now, and with people interacting in more places, there's more content out there that people can draw from, right? When you look at some of the things that are happening now with candidates, I'm sure it's very hard to vet candidates. I haven't done it before, but when you look at any candidate now, they probably have 15 years of online stuff they've said, and they may not have always been on their toes over the past 15 years. I'm sure I haven't been on my toes over the past 15 years either. But you can find all sorts of things like that, and you, as time goes on, of course, too, as sensibilities change. Sometimes things are just outrageous and shouldn't have been said in the first place. Sometimes things have been said and sensibilities have changed, and it doesn't age well, and so they don't look good. So I think campaigns will continue to do that. I think it's probably generally fair game. There's an ethical line someplace in there where, if you're completely distorting something, that's not right, and you'd like to think that campaigns will know what that line is and follow it. I'm sure that isn't the case, though. I'm sure there are some that don't do that. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be continue to be one of those things that campaigns do. It's also one of those things too that journalism does, because they look for those things too, right? When you look back at the last election cycle, the infamous blackface stuff that appeared about Justin Trudeau, I think it was a week before the election, or I can't remember exactly. But it was shortly before the election. Who knows what the genesis of that really was, but journalists were happy to make a story of it, and I think it, there's no question it got even international coverage at that stage. But this is going to happen. It's going to continue to happen. So I think it's just one of those things where you have to make sure that, if you're going to use this in your campaign, you have to make sure it's being done within some ethical bounds, mm-hmm. because if you can completely backfire on you too. if you try and twist things too far.
Well, I think it's also probably a bit of a case of like, I know you are, but what am I, right? Like, I mean, I'm thinking of two particular examples in this election campaign. One where the Liberals are putting out ads saying that Aaron O'Toole would repeal this assault rifle ban that they instituted, and yes, that was a policy that he had at one point. I'm being a bit facetious, but he has now changed his position on that, so it's no longer true. And vice versa, you also have this conservative ad that's being run about taxing the capital gains on your home sales, where Trudeau was asked directly about it, said no, and then they said, you can't trust him, he's still going to do it, right? So here we have examples of both leaders saying, like, I will not do that thing. And their opposing parties are saying, but you probably will. So, is there a need for better transparency measures or anything like that? I mean, I know I don't want to get government involved in political campaigns, but one suggestion I have heard that is interesting is at the end of American commercials, it's very common, if not, I believe actually the law, for the candidate to appear on the screen saying, I am so-and-so and I endorse this message. There is no way to hide from that and suggest that you are, this is being run by somebody else. Are things like that measures we can look at, or is this just something that people expect from their politicians and they really don't mind?
Well, I think those kinds of measures are great to have. I don't know if they will meaningfully change any kind of situation where a campaign is just going to completely misrepresent another candidate's position. Although I think this is where the media do come into play, right? The media are great at holding people to account, but there is a bit of a weakness here, and I'll just sort of unpack that for a second. So we saw back in 2016 in the US, really the first time this was sort of weaponized to a great extent, where candidate will say something completely outrageous because they're trying to connect with a certain audience or they have some sort of goal in mind. And the media report, so such and such candidate said something completely outrageous and repeats it. And whether or not that outrageous thing was true or accurate, it didn't matter. They got repeated over and over again, and it gave a platform to that outrageous thing. And to me, this is a bit of a weakness in the way media currently work, is in that I think from an editorial standpoint, even though in the past they used to just sort of look at this stuff straight up and say, okay, well, the candidate said it, so we should talk about it and then provide a counterpoint perhaps. But when the thing is so outrageous and just falsely, like obviously false, I think there's a place for media to just not report on that thing in the first place. But take it to your example. So claim about assault weapons ban, candidate has said, no, I'm not going to do that. This is where the media can really kind of hold the candidates to account and put them on the spot and use the platform they have to embarrass a candidate, frankly, to keep them honest, as it were, in these situations. So I think there's that's probably the thing that'll do the most in keeping candidates honest. But certainly if there are other things that we can do from a regulatory standpoint, great. But I think it comes down to, do they feel that candidates will do what they feel will get them the most benefit with the least risk?
Yeah, I mean, this is the reality. Is you have one 35-day stretch, and if you look back and you say, I left it on the table and that cost me the election, I mean, obviously depending on ethical bounds, but that could be a pretty tough spot to find yourself in a few weeks' time. So I do want to ask you specifically. I teased it off the top. You just said in the American election there were a lot of ridiculous statements made by people. We didn't necessarily see apologies and backtracks from those candidates. That was maybe an exception to the rule, but normally we do see that. And even in this election so far, there's been multiple instances. I can think of Justin Trudeau hanging on to his candidate in Kitchener Centre despite sexual assault allegations and abuse allegations, of which he eventually then dropped the candidate. Aaron O'Toole, the example we've just used on the assault rifle position, of two pretty prominent reversals. You, on your podcast Reputation Town, do an apology sort of evaluator and tracker. You talk about the effectiveness of them. What do you think about those apologies? Not necessarily we don't necessarily have to go bit by bit over them, but what makes for a good backtrack? Is it ever too early to pull the trigger on that? Like, I'm curious your observations doing this for some time and how they apply to this sort of political campaigning context that we're seeing unfold before our eyes.
So great question. The key thing about, well, let me back up for a second. If you Google government backtracked, it's actually kind of funny because you see this whole litany of, every level of government backtracking on different policies that you've completely forgotten about because in effect, they did their backtrack and no one really remembers it anymore because it's ancient history. Ultimately, it depends on a couple of things. First off, the speed at which you do it. I think there's differences between the apology and the backtrack, but some similarities too. The speed at which you do it is important, I think, in both cases. If you act quickly, it's a lot easier than if you let it metastasize and you have a couple media cycles of your current position being in place. Makes it harder to back away from it. I also think it's important to when you think about a backtrack, what is the reason for it? Like, if there's substance behind the change in policy, well, that's a heck of a lot easier to manage than if it's just sort of for convenience, right? Like, let's just say you had a policy position 3 years ago and you've changed it today because a heck of a lot has happened in 3 years and materially everything is different. And so it makes just a lot of sense that the policy is different. So I don't think that there's a lot of hay that can be made by opponents over that kind of backtrack because there's a lot of substance behind the reasons why. If it's really just for expediency and if it's, just because I was taking heat or I feel like, I'm going to be better positioned for doing it, then you're kind of rolling the dice, right? Like there may be some benefit, but there may be an equal amount of blowback that comes from that too.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was in politics, I always used to talk about flip-flops and which side you ended up on at the end, right? And so you mentioned all these government backtracks that have flown into obscurity. People don't remember anymore. The analogy I always used to use was, if you come home from work every day and your kids are saying, we want a dog, and for 30 days you say no, and on day 31 you say yes, they're not going to care about the month that just happened. But if you're telling them for 30 days they're going to get a dog, and on 31 you tell them no dog's coming, you're going to hear about it for a long time, right? So
exactly, yeah.
You need to make sure that you end up on the right side. And to your point, the earlier you can do it, the better.
And it also depends on how much do people care about the thing, right? Like, the kids would care a lot about the dog, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a big thing to them. But for some policies, it's so inside baseball or it's so obscure that no one's going to care. But ultimately, it comes down to the substance of the matter.
Well, and then it also has this ability, right? Regardless of the individual file or issue that's at stake, but has this ability to create a reputation about the individual, right? To create a reputation about the leader in this case, make them seem like they're a bit hypocritical, or make them seem like they don't have what it takes to make important decisions that stick to them. So, this topic of reputation and image, I think the backtrack really does play into that. And elections are so much about image, right? As somebody who does comms, I mean, this is kind of the last theme I want to touch on today is about the image of the leaders. I saw a Twitter post about the watches that the three different leaders wear, and Aaron O'Toole's wearing a $400 Fitbit or something, and the others are wearing Rolexes and what have you. And they're like, "See, man of the people." I mean, that's a really, really taking it down to the ultimate level. But the way that these leaders present themselves, have you noticed one do it better than the others? Is Justin Trudeau really that good at putting forward an image that he is for every Canadian? Is Aaron O'Toole that good at showing that he can be someone who makes tough decisions? Like, I'm curious about how the leaders themselves have come across to you in this election.
So, sometimes events overtake the individuals. When you look at the start of this campaign, it was well, everything's weird about this campaign, right? I was saying to a colleague that at the start of the campaign, I was sat down to watch the 10 o'clock news with my daughter, and the election didn't even get covered until 10 minutes into the news, because there was a pandemic and then Afghanistan, and then the election was the third thing. And I couldn't remember actually a time when a federal election was happening and it got bumped that far down the news hierarchy. And then of course it was, you know, it seemed like the Liberals couldn't do anything right in the first week and a half. It reminded me of that episode of The Simpsons where Sideshow Bob's like in a parking lot and he's like stumbling around and stepping on rakes and bonking himself in the face like every way he turns. Like everything was going against them for little reasons. And so when you think about how they presented themselves, well, it didn't really matter because all these little missteps were dominating the news and dominating the narrative of the campaign. And of course, you know, it's a long campaign, and I bet you at the end of it, no one's going to really think back to the stuff that happened in the first week as closely at all. But the image does matter, and I think in most parts, it relates to some innate characteristic of each candidate. And if a candidate has the ability to come across as someone who people feel like they can have some affinity for, that's great. They need that to win. It's difficult to manufacture it around them. Like, you know, this is like the syndrome where you take the candidate and you put them in the denim shirt on the weekend, and it looks like, you know, they're like a fish out of the water. Like that I don't think there's only so far you can take that. So the candidate has to have some core characteristics in order to be able to connect. And I think, interestingly, in this campaign, especially with young Canadians, Jagmeet Singh is you know, repeatedly talked about as somebody who they feel like is a fresh new voice. They like the way he presents himself. Actually, it's interesting when you think back to the first speech he gave after he became leader, and you think the way he's comporting himself now, like he's made a real journey in terms of how he presents himself and has improved as a leader, I think. But at any rate, I think they're all pretty strong when it comes to image and visuals. And yeah, it's easy to pick apart little bits here and there around the edges, but all in all, I think I'm not sure it matters so much when an election campaign, it comes down to that fundamental question there isn't a good answer for, like we talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one interesting one, and maybe the last question I'll leave you with, is you mentioned it earlier, and you mentioned in your answer to this last question about the Liberals were on the defensive for the first while. Momentum was clearly with other parties, you know, mainly with the Conservatives, but certainly wasn't with the Liberals. We could kind of agree on that. And now, as we get closer to the end of the election, it looks like it's turned itself back to the Liberal Party, and the Conservatives are now struggling to gain ground and to keep that momentum they had in the early days. You know, it doesn't strike me as, say, you know, one of these defining moments. I always think back to my Canadian politics courses in university, and they'd show the photo of Robert Stanfield in 1974 dropping the football on the tarmac, and then the headline runs across the country, you know, Stanfield drops the ball and all this, and it just, like, it had this prevailing notion that maybe this guy wasn't ready, and it all kind of fell apart from there. And how much stock do you put in one photograph? Who knows? But the fact of the matter is that it happened. There hasn't necessarily been that this time. I mean, you could make the argument perhaps that the Liberals shifted from defending their record to attacking the Conservative record, and that's been somewhat effective. But is there a particular moment, a defining communications change? Has there been what do you attribute that change of momentum to? Or is it just perhaps people finally waking up and realizing there's election on and tuning in for the first time?
You know, it's hard to pin it down to any one thing. Really, when I think about election day, and I think about people lining up, trying to social distance, masks on, you know, queuing into polling stations, I just have trouble seeing the turnout for this election being high as a result. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people have voted by mail and are overwhelming the advanced polls. But so I don't know how much we can actually read into, you know, the day-to-day, you know, media, the way it's being portrayed, and the outcome of the election. I think you're right, though. I think there are those moments where there's like a something that happens. It gets captured by social media now or the media in the past, I think Stansfield is a great example, right? That I think I saw an interview with the photographer who shot those pictures, and he said that he shot 36 pictures of them throwing that football around, and he sent them into the news desk, and the one picture of him fumbling the ball was the one that ran on the front page of the Globe and Mail. And or you think, there's other examples too, right? You think, look back to 2004. Howard Dean, he was the governor of Vermont, or former governor of Vermont, who was running for the Democrats. And he was, I think he just finished the Iowa caucus, and they had that infamous now campaign rally. And in the midst of him being really excited about how they were going to keep going to the next state and the next state, and eventually take the White House, and he ended his little speech with a scream, like, yeah. And it became this, thing that just sunk his campaign, like, oh, he must be unhinged because he shouted yeah in the midst of a campaign rally in this sort of shrill way. There hasn't been any event like that, and there's still something like that still may happen. I have a feeling though that with the way that all the campaigns are being so careful, I don't imagine any kind of thing that's going to emerge. But when you look at how much is communication going to affect the outcome of this election? I could be wrong, but at the end of the day, because of the really unprecedented circumstances as this election is being conducted in, I'm not sure a heck of a lot of what we've seen communications wise is going to matter. I think it's got to come down to how many people actually go out and vote on election day, and how many of those people really think that this was the time to have an election, and how many people are worried about the things that the Liberals are trying to project, which are, key issues that are stock, sort of wedge issues in politics in Canada: guns, abortion, other things like that, and that people will think about and think, oh, okay, well, I don't want to take any chances when it comes to that stuff.
Yeah, I think, you made a unique observation there, which is the situation in which these communications are being done. There's you mentioned this example of a rally where the momentum gets away from you a little bit. Like, you can't have a rally these days, right? Like, there haven't been real rallies on this election campaign. We've seen the people throwing rocks at Trudeau or protesting his events, but for example, Aaron O'Toole has done probably 50% of his media avails and events in a studio, right? Which is incredibly unique to this election campaign, not something that you could do in normal times. So to your point about mitigating those let's call them natural occurrences that may happen in those weird events, it's pretty easy not to have a tour fail or something like that when you're sitting in your own studio, and that's just something that we couldn't contemplate in elections past. So an interesting observation to see if that's something that carries on into the future, I would imagine too.
Exactly.
But we have held you for long enough. You probably need to get back to work. I need to do the same. So appreciate you coming on the podcast. I think the message that you ended on is a really interesting one, which is, what will the voter turnout actually look like in this election? Nobody really knows. I have a feeling if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably somebody who votes anyways. But if you're not, go do it. But that said, John, really appreciate you coming on the program, taking the time today.
Thanks, Mitch. It was great.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of StrategyCorp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of StrategyCorp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time.